The Fox News studio buzzed with tension as Donald Trump adjusted his red tie, that familiar smirk spreading across his face. He'd come to this special live town hall with one goal: destroy the credibility of Judge Edward Chen, the federal judge who had ruled against him in multiple cases. Trump's confidence was sky-high after all. This was his turf, his audience, his moment to strike back. Judge Chen is a disaster, folks, Trump declared to the cheering crowd, his voice booming through the speakers. Total disgrace to the bench. This guy has no idea what he's doing. Probably the worst judge in America. Sad. He's been targeting me from day one because he can't handle that I won the election. The audience erupted in applause, Massachusetts GA hats bobbing throughout the studio. Trump fed off their energy, pointing dramatically toward the empty chair where Judge Chen would soon sit. He's about to get schooled on live television. This is going to be beautiful, believe me. What Trump didn't know was that Judge Chen had spent 30 years on the federal bench, presiding over some of the most complex legal cases in American history. The quiet, methodical judge had something Trump never expected: a perfect memory for legal precedent and zero tolerance for courtroom theatrics. Backstage, Judge Chen sat calmly reviewing his notes, completely unbothered by Trump's opening attacks. His aide whispered, "Sir, he's really going after you out there." Chen looked up with the slightest smile. "Good. Let him keep talking. Before we watch Trump walk into the legal equivalent of a buzzsaw, smash that like button and subscribe for more explosive political moments. Drop a comment below with where you're watching from." Sean Hannity took center stage as the moderator, his enthusiasm barely contained as he introduced the former president. "Ladies and gentlemen, the 45th President of the United States, Donald J. Trump." The studio exploded with cheers, red hats, and American flags waving throughout the audience. Trump stood confidently, soaking in the adoration. His navy suit was perfectly tailored, his signature red tie catching the studio lights. This was his Elementa-friendly crowd, supportive host, and the national spotlight. He'd built his entire political career on moments like this, turning every appearance into a rally-style performance. "Thank you, Sean. Great to be here," Trump began, his voice carrying that familiar cadence his supporters loved. "We're going to talk about the corrupt judges today, folks. These activist judges who think they can overturn the will of the people. Judge Chen is the perfect example, completely biased, totally unfair, probably appointed by Obama." The crowd roared approval. Hannity nodded enthusiastically. "Mr. President, you've been very critical of Judge Chen's rulings. Tell us why you think he's been unfair to you." Trump's eyes lit up. This was exactly the opening he wanted. "John, this guy has ruled against me in case after case, even when the law was clearly on my side. He's part of the deep state conspiracy to take down Donald Trump. I've dealt with thousands of judges in my business career, and let me tell you, this guy doesn't know the first thing about justice." The studio atmosphere shifted as Hannity reluctantly introduced the other guest. "And joining us now is Federal Judge Edward Chen of the Northern District of California." The applause was noticeably quieter, scattered and polite, rather than enthusiastic. Judge Chen walked onto the stage with measured steps, his black judicial robes replaced by a simple gray suit. At 68, he carried himself with the dignity that came from 3 decades on the federal bench. His expression was calm, almost serene, showing no reaction to Trump's earlier attacks or the crowd's lukewarm reception. Unlike Trump's bombastic presence, Chen projected quiet authority. His credentials were impeccable, appointed by President Clinton in 1994, confirmed unanimously by the Senate, Harvard Law graduate, former prosecutor, and veteran of over 10,000 cases. He'd presided over everything from corporate fraud to constitutional challenges, earning respect from lawyers across the political spectrum. "Thank you for having me," Chen said simply, his voice steady and professional. He took his seat across from Trump, maintaining perfect posture and eye contact. There was no showmanship, no playing to the crowd, just the comportment of someone who'd spent his career dealing with facts rather than feelings. Trump immediately leaned forward aggressively. "Judge, glad you could make it. Hope you're ready to explain to the American people why you've been so unfair to me and so many other Republicans." Chen's response was measured. "Mr. Biden, Trump, I'm here to discuss the importance of judicial independence and the rule of law. I think the American people deserve to understand how our court system actually works." The contrast couldn't have been more stark. In one corner sat Trump, master of media manipulation, expert at controlling narratives, comfortable using his platform to attack institutions and individuals. His entire strategy depended on overwhelming opponents with aggressive rhetoric and crowd energy. In the other corner sat Judge Chen, a man who'd built his career on careful analysis, constitutional principles, and measured decision-making. He'd faced down corporate giants, political pressure, and media scrutiny for 30 years without wavering from his judicial oath. This wasn't just a debate about specific court cases. This was a fundamental clash between two worldviews: Trump's belief that loyalty and strength trumped legal technicalities, versus Chen's commitment to impartial justice regardless of political consequences. For Trump, this appearance was about discrediting a judge who'd become a thorn in his side, rallying his base, and reinforcing his narrative of judicial persecution. For Chen, it was about defending the integrity of the federal court system and explaining why judges must remain independent from political pressure. What Trump didn't realize was that he was about to face someone who'd spent decades calmly dismantling far more sophisticated arguments than campaign rally talking points. Judge Chen had come prepared not with political rhetoric, but with something far more dangerous to Trump's narrative: precise legal facts and constitutional knowledge. The stage was set for a collision between raw political theater and judicial precision. Only one of them would walk away with their credibility intact. Hannity started with what seemed like a softball question. "Mr. President, you've been very vocal about Judge Chen's rulings. Can you give us specific examples of where you think he got it wrong?" Trump's confidence was immediately apparent. "Sean, where do I even start? This guy has ruled against me on immigration, on executive privilege, on election integrity, everything. He clearly has it out for me personally. It's not about the law. It's about politics." The audience nodded approvingly as Trump continued. "I've won cases in front of real judges, good judges, fair judges. But Chen, he's made up his mind before he even hears the case. Probably gets his orders from the Democrats." Judge Chen listened without expression, taking notes on a small pad. When Hannity turned to him, his response was clinical. "Mr. Trump, I've presided over approximately 10,000 cases in my 30 years on the bench. My rulings are based solely on legal precedent, constitutional law, and the evidence presented. Political affiliation has never been a factor in any decision I've made." The room was noticeably cooler toward Chen, but he seemed completely unbothered by the hostile environment. Trump leaned forward, sensing an opening. "Judge, you say politics doesn't matter. But let's be honest, you were appointed by Bill Clinton. How can anyone believe you're not biased against Republicans?" It was the kind of attack that usually put opponents on the defensive, forcing them to deny political motivations. Trump's supporters in the audience murmured agreement. Surely the judge would stumble here. Chen's response was matter-of-fact. "Mr. Trump, I was actually confirmed by the Senate unanimously. That means every Republican senator voted for me, including some who are still serving today. My confirmation hearing lasted less than an hour because there were no objections to my qualifications or temperament." He paused, then added with the slightest edge to his voice, "Perhaps you're confusing judicial independence with bias. They're quite different concepts." Hannity quickly jumped in to help Trump. "But Judge, surely you can understand why the president might feel targeted when ruling after ruling goes against him." Trump couldn't let that slide. "Exactly, Sean. It's always against me, never for me. That's not justice, that's a witch hunt." His voice rose as he pointed directly at Chen. "You want to talk about independence? How about independent from the deep state?" The crowd erupted in cheers and applause. Trump fed off their energy, standing up partially from his chair. "This judge has been gunning for me since day one. Everyone knows it. The fake news media loves him because he gives them the headlines they want." Chen remained seated, completely calm as Trump gestured dramatically. When the applause died down, he spoke in the same measured tone. "Mr. Trump, I notice you're making a lot of personal accusations, but you haven't cited a single legal precedent or constitutional principle that I allegedly violated. Would you like to discuss the actual law?" It was a subtle challenge, delivered without emotion, but it hit its mark. Trump's face reddened slightly. He wasn't used to being asked for legal specifics. "The law?" Trump scoffed, his confidence masking his uncertainty. "Judge, I've been involved in more legal cases than you've probably seen in your entire career. I know the law better than most lawyers, better than most judges, frankly." The audience laughed and applauded at Trump's braggadocio. He was back in his comfort zone, making broad claims about his superior knowledge. "The law says a president has executive privilege. The law says states run their own elections. The law says judges should be fair and impartial. You've ignored all of that." Trump's voice grew louder with each point. Chen adjusted his glasses and made another note. Mr. Trump, since you mention executive privilege, are you familiar with United States v. Nixon 1974? The Supreme Court ruled unanimously that executive privilege cannot be used to withhold evidence in criminal proceedings. The specificity of the citation caught Trump off guard. That's completely different, he stammered. Nixon was Nixon. I'm not Nixon. You're correct, Chen replied evenly. The legal principle, however, remains the same regardless of which president attempts to invoke it improperly. Trump's frustration was becoming visible. Judge, with all due respect, you're talking about old cases that don't apply to modern situations. The presidency has evolved. The threats we face today are different. He turned to the audience, seeking their support. This is exactly what I'm talking about, folks. These judges live in the past. They don't understand the real world. They make decisions based on dusty old books instead of common sense. The crowd responded enthusiastically, but Chen was unmoved. Mr. Trump, constitutional law isn't a matter of opinion or evolution. The principles that govern our legal system are intentionally enduring. That's what separates us from countries where law changes based on who's in power. Trump waved dismissively. That's lawyer talk, Judge. The American people want results, not lectures about constitutional whatever. They want a president who can get things done, not someone tied up by technicalities. Chen's next words were spoken quietly but carried enormous weight. Mr. Trump, those technicalities are the only things standing between democracy and tyranny. The comment about tyranny clearly stung. Trump's demeanor shifted, becoming more aggressive. Tyranny? Judge, the real tyranny is unelected judges overturning the will of the people. You think you know better than 75 million Americans who voted for me? He stood up fully now, using his height to try to intimidate. This is the problem with our court system judges who think they're kings, who think they can just wave their gavel and ignore democracy. The audience was on their feet cheering Trump's passionate defense. He was in full rally mode now, feeding off their energy. Chen remained seated, his calm demeanor a stark contrast to Trump's theatrics. Mr. Trump, judges don't ignore democracy, we protect it. Our job is to ensure that no one, regardless of how many votes they receive, can violate the Constitution. He paused, then delivered what felt like a gentle rebuke. Even presidents take an oath to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution. That oath doesn't have exceptions for popularity or electoral margins. Trump sensed he was losing control of the narrative. Time for his nuclear option personal attacks. Judge Chen, how many businesses have you run? How many jobs have you created? How many real-world decisions have you made that actually affected people's lives? The questions came rapid fire, designed to make Chen seem out of touch. You've spent your whole career in government, living off taxpayers, making decisions from your ivory tower. You don't understand what real Americans go through. The audience ate it up, cheering at each attack on the elitist judge. Trump was back in his element, turning this into a populist versus establishment narrative. Chen listened patiently, then responded with devastating calm. Mr. Trump, I've spent 30 years making decisions that affected millions of Americans' criminal defendants, facing life sentences, families fighting for civil rights, corporations trying to evade environmental laws, immigrants seeking asylum. He looked directly at Trump. Every case that comes before my court involves real people with real problems. The difference is, I have to base my decisions on evidence and law, not on what's popular or politically convenient. Trump realized he needed to end this quickly before Chen's calm competence started to register with viewers. That's exactly the problem, Judge. You hide behind evidence and law when common sense says something completely different. He turned to Hannity, looking for support. Sean, this is why our court system is broken. We have judges who care more about precedent than justice, more about procedure than results. The crowd applauded, but there was something different now, a subtle shift in energy as some audience members began to appreciate Chen's measured responses. Chen saw his opening and took it with surgical precision. Mr. Trump, you keep talking about justice and results. Can you tell me which of my specific rulings you believe was legally incorrect, and which legal precedent I should have followed instead? It was a simple question that cut to the heart of everything. Trump had spent 20 minutes making personal attacks and broad accusations, but he hadn't cited a single legal case or constitutional principle. Chen was calling his bluff on live television. Trump's face flushed deep red. He opened his mouth to respond, then closed it. For perhaps the first time in his political career, he was genuinely speechless on camera. The silence stretched for several uncomfortable seconds before Trump finally exploded. "This is ridiculous. I don't need to play your lawyer games." And with that outburst, he'd walked directly into Judge Chen's trap. Judge Chen's expression remained perfectly neutral as Trump's outburst echoed through the studio. The audience had grown noticeably quieter, sensing something had shifted in the confrontation's dynamic. "Mr. Trump," Chen said softly, "the lawyer games you're referring to are actually called constitutional law. They're the foundation of our entire legal system." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small, leather-bound copy of the Constitution. "Since you've questioned my rulings and claimed they're politically motivated, perhaps we should examine the actual legal basis for some of these decisions you find so objectionable." Hannity looked uncomfortable. This wasn't going according to the script he'd imagined. "Judge, we don't need to get into legal technicalities that our audience might not follow." "On the contrary, Sean," Chen interrupted politely, "I think the American people are smart enough to understand when their constitution is being properly applied versus when it's being ignored for political convenience." Trump slumped back in his chair, suddenly looking less commanding. The judge's calm authority was beginning to fill the studio in a way that Trump's bluster couldn't match. Chen opened his small constitution and turned to a marked page. "Let's start with immigration law, since Mr. Trump mentioned it first. You claimed my rulings on immigration were unfair. Are you familiar with Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution?" Trump waved dismissively. "Judge, I don't need a civics lesson. It grants Congress, not the President, the power to establish a uniform rule of naturalization," Chen continued as if Trump hadn't spoken. "When your administration attempted to unilaterally change immigration procedures established by Congress, I was constitutionally obligated to rule against you." He looked directly at Trump. "Were you suggesting I should have ignored the Constitution to give you a favorable ruling?" The question hung in the air. Trump opened his mouth, then closed it again. Any answer would be damaging. Either he'd have to admit wanting unconstitutional treatment, or acknowledge Chen was right. That's not what I said," Trump finally mumbled. "Then what exactly are you saying, Mr. Trump? Because you can't have it both. Either judges should follow the Constitution regardless of politics, or they should give presidents whatever they want. Which is it?" Chen turned another page in his pocket Constitution. "You also mentioned executive privilege. Let me quote the exact language of Article 2. The executive power shall be vested in a president. Note that it says executive power, not unlimited power, or power to ignore subpoenas." Trump's discomfort was becoming more visible. "Judge, you're taking things out of context." "Am I?" Chen's voice remained calm but carried new authority. "In Trump v. Vance, the Supreme Court, including 3 justices you appointed, ruled 7-2 that presidents are not immune from state criminal subpoenas. Were they also being unfair to you?" The studio fell silent. Even Trump's supporters seemed to be listening now, perhaps realizing they were getting a constitutional law education they'd never expected. "Furthermore," Chen continued, "in Trump v. Thompson, regarding the 6th of January documents, the Supreme Court refused to block the release of your White House records. That was an 8-1 decision, Mr. Trump. Were 8 Supreme Court justices conspiring against you?" Trump's face was growing redder by the minute. "That's completely different. Those cases were decided based on the same constitutional principles I used," Chen finished. "Unless you're claiming the Supreme Court is also part of this conspiracy against you?" Chen flipped to another section, his movements deliberate and practiced. "You mentioned election integrity. Are you familiar with the Supremacy Clause found in Article 6? Trump looked around desperately, seeking help from Hannity, who was doing his best to become invisible behind his note card. "It establishes that federal law supersedes state law when they conflict," Chen explained to the audience. "When your administration sued states for changing election procedures due to COVID, you were essentially arguing that state election officials couldn't follow federal health guidelines. The law was clear." He paused, letting that sink in. "Moreover, in every single election-related case you filed, courts, including Republican, appointed judges found no evidence of fraud that would change the outcome. Were they all conspiring against you too?" Trump exploded. "Those judges didn't look at the evidence. They threw out cases on technicalities." Chen's response was swift and devastating. "Mr. Trump, technicalities, like lack of evidence, lack of standing, and lack of legal basis, aren't technicalities. They're fundamental requirements of our legal system. You can't win a court case just because you believe something strongly." The judge's voice grew slightly sharper. "Since we're discussing your relationship with the courts, perhaps we should address your public statements about ongoing cases." Are you familiar with the concept of contempt of court? Trump shifted uncomfortably. Judge, I have First Amendment rights. Indeed you do, Chen agreed. But the First Amendment doesn't protect speech that interferes with judicial proceedings or threatens court officers. When you publicly attack prosecutors, judges, and court staff while cases are pending, you're not exercising free speech. You're attempting to intimidate the judicial process. He looked directly at Trump. In my 30 years on the bench, I've held multiple defendants in contempt for far less than what you do on social media every day. The audience was completely silent now. Even Trump's most vocal supporters seemed stunned by the methodical legal dismantling they were witnessing. Are you threatening me, Judge? Trump asked, his voice lacking its usual bombast. I'm educating you, Mr. Trump. There's a difference. Chen closed his pocket constitution and looked directly into the camera, addressing the audience. Ladies and gentlemen, every federal judge takes an oath to administer justice without respect to persons and to faithfully discharge our duties under the Constitution. He turned back to Trump. Presidents take a similar oath, to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution, not to preserve their own power, not to protect their political interests, but to defend the Constitution. His voice carried new gravity. When a president attacks judges for following the law, when they claim courts are rigged because they don't get the outcomes they want, when they suggest that judges should consider politics rather than precedent, they're attacking the very foundation of our democratic system. Trump tried to interrupt. That's not what Mr. Trump, Chen continued, his voice now carrying the full authority of 3 decades on the federal bench. Every single ruling you've criticized tonight was based on established constitutional principles that have governed this country for over 200 years. If you believe those principles are wrong, you're not just disagreeing with me, you're disagreeing with the entire framework of American democracy. Chen stood up slowly, his gray suit somehow carrying more authority than Trump's expensive tailoring. Here's what I think the American people need to understand. Judges don't work for presidents. We don't work for political parties. We don't work for popular opinion. He held up his pocket constitution. We work for this document and the principles it represents. When those principles conflict with what any president wants, Republican or Democrat or oath requires us to choose the Constitution. The studio was dead silent. Even the camera operators seemed frozen, recognizing they were witnessing something unprecedented. So when you ask me to explain why my rulings have been unfair to you, Mr. Trump, here's my answer. They haven't been unfair to you. They've been faithful to the Constitution. If you can't tell the difference between those two things, then perhaps the problem isn't with the courts. Chen sat back down, his delivery complete. Trump sat across from him, looking smaller somehow, deflated by the systematic legal education he'd just received on live television. The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity before Hannity desperately tried to regain control. Well, we're going to take a quick commercial break. But the damage was done. In less than 15 minutes, Judge Chen had transformed from Trump's target into his teacher, methodically dismantling every legal argument while maintaining perfect judicial temperament. Trump had walked into what he thought would be a friendly venue to attack a perceived enemy. Instead, he'd received a constitutional law seminar that exposed the fundamental weaknesses in every anti-judicial argument he'd ever made. As Fox News reluctantly cut to commercial, the control room erupted in chaos. Producers frantically whispered into headsets while social media managers watched in horror as clips of the confrontation began flooding the internet. This was supposed to be Trump's moment to destroy Judge Chen's credibility. Instead, they'd just aired 15 minutes of the former president getting systematically schooled in constitutional law. Within minutes, Judge Chen schools Trump was trending nationwide. The clip of Chen asking Trump to cite specific legal precedents followed by Trump's stammering non-response was being shared at a rate that threatened to crash Twitter's servers. TikTok exploded with reaction videos, most featuring young people's shocked faces as they watched a federal judge calmly dismantle Trump's legal arguments. Did anyone else just watch Trump get a constitutional law education on live TV? Read one viral tweet with over 100,000 likes in the first 20 minutes. Another popular post featured a side-by-side comparison. Trump at the beginning. I know the law better than judges versus Trump at the end. I don't need to play lawyer games. The moment when Chen stood up and delivered his final statement about working for the Constitution, not for presidents, was being clipped and shared across every platform. Law students were posting it in study groups. Constitutional law professors were already planning to use it in their classes. Even international media picked up the story, with headlines like, American Judge Schools Former President in Live Television Constitutional Law Lesson. Back in the studio, Trump sat slumped in his chair during the commercial break, no longer the commanding presence he'd been 20 minutes earlier. His usual post-appearance routine of glad-handing and photo ops was notably absent. Instead, he huddled with his communications team, their urgent whispers barely audible over the studio noise. "We need to get on Truth Social immediately," one aide whispered. "Control the narrative before this gets worse." But Trump seemed uncharacteristically quiet, still processing what had just happened to him on live television. Judge Chen, meanwhile, remained in his seat, calmly reviewing his notes as if he'd just finished a routine court session rather than delivering one of the most devastating political takedowns in recent memory. When a Fox News producer approached him about a potential follow-up segment, Chen politely declined. "I think I've said everything that needs to be said about constitutional law for one evening." Conservative legal scholars who had remained silent during Trump's attacks on the judiciary suddenly found their voices. Within hours, social media was filled with posts from Republican lawyers praising Chen's masterful defense of judicial independence and textbook explanation of constitutional principles. Even some Trump allies privately admitted the former president had walked into a legal buzzsaw. Democratic politicians were more openly celebratory. "Judge Chen just gave America a civics lesson we desperately needed," tweeted one senator. "This is what it looks like when constitutional expertise meets political bluster." Legal organizations that had been reluctant to wade into political waters issued statements supporting Chen's explanation of judicial independence. By the next morning, Judge Chen's performance had transcended political boundaries to become a cultural moment. Law schools across the country reported spikes in applications. Constitutional law textbooks saw their first sales increase in years as people sought to understand the legal principles Chen had referenced. "Pocket Constitution" became a trending search term as Americans rushed to buy copies of the document Chen had used so effectively. The image of him standing with his small, leather-bound Constitution became an instant meme, with captions like, "When you bring facts to a feelings fight," and "This is what actual expertise looks like." Late-night comedy shows had a field day. Trump went on Fox News to attack a federal judge and ended up getting a law degree he didn't ask for, joked one host. The good news is, now Trump finally understands Article 2 of the Constitution. The bad news is, it took a federal judge explaining it like he was in third grade. But perhaps most significantly, the confrontation sparked serious conversations about constitutional literacy. High school civics teachers reported students asking sophisticated questions about judicial independence and executive power. Law libraries saw increased foot traffic from ordinary citizens wanting to understand their constitutional rights. The phrase, "I work for the Constitution, not for presidents," was printed on everything from t-shirts to coffee mugs. Chen's calm, methodical approach became a template for how to handle bad faith political attacks with facts and dignity. 3 months later, the impact was still reverberating through American politics. Trump had largely stopped his public attacks on federal judges, perhaps finally understanding that such confrontations might not go his way. When asked about the Fox News appearance in subsequent interviews, he typically deflected, "That was a long time ago. We're focused on the future now." Judge Chen returned to his courtroom, where he continued making decisions based on law and precedent rather than political considerations. When reporters occasionally asked him about the confrontation, his response was always the same. "I was simply explaining how our constitutional system works. Every American should understand these principles." For the legal community, Chen's performance became legendary, a masterclass in how to defend judicial independence without descending into partisan politics. Law schools began teaching courses on constitutional communication, using Chen's appearance as the gold standard for explaining complex legal principles to lay audiences. Most importantly, the confrontation reminded Americans that expertise still mattered, that knowledge and preparation could triumph over bluster and intimidation. In an era when political theater often overshadowed substance, Judge Chen had shown that calm competence and constitutional knowledge remained more powerful than any amount of crowd-pleasing rhetoric. The lasting image wasn't of Trump's anger or the audience's initial hostility toward Chen. It was of a 68-year-old federal judge, standing calmly in a Fox News studio, holding a pocket constitution, and explaining why no one, not even former presidents, was above the law. Judge Chen had done something remarkable. He'd turned a political attack into a teaching moment, transforming Trump's attempted character assassination into a national civics lesson. In doing so, he'd reminded Americans of something they'd perhaps forgotten, that their democracy was protected not by politicians or popularity, but by people who understood and honored the Constitution. The former president had walked into that studio confident he could destroy a judge's reputation. Instead, he'd walked into a constitutional law professor who happened to have 30 years of federal court experience. The result was 15 minutes of television that would be studied, shared, and remembered as the moment expertise triumphed over empty rhetoric. Trump had wanted to expose Judge Chen as a partisan hack. Instead, Chen had exposed himself as exactly what he'd claimed to be: a federal judge who worked for the Constitution, not for any president. And in that revelation, he'd given America a powerful reminder of what real judicial independence looked like. This was more than just a political confrontation. It was a defense of democracy itself, delivered with the quiet authority that only comes from 3 decades of faithful service to the Constitution. Don't miss our next breakdown of the most explosive political moments. Smash that subscribe button and hit the notification bell so you never miss these crucial confrontations. What did you think of Judge Chen's constitutional masterclass? Drop your thoughts in the comments below.